Well, good stuff. Good afternoon, everyone from Scotland and the rest of the UK, and welcome to this event from the Asia Scotland Institute. My name is Alex Humphreys, and I'll moderate today's discussion. Also joining me from the Asia Scotland Institute is Roddy Gow, Chairman and Founder. The Foreign Commonwealth and Development Office pursues national interests and projects the UK as a force for good in the world. The FCDO also promotes the interests of British citizens, safeguards the UK's security, defends the country's values, reduces poverty, and tackles global challenges with our international partners. This is a very wide range of responsibilities and an increasingly complex world, and requires people who can understand different cultures and how they can find mutual interest in political as well as business relations. Joining us today is Jon Wilks. Jon will talk about how the modern British diplomat strives to meet such challenges. Jon Wilks, CMG, is the British ambassador to Qatar and previously the ambassador to the Republic of Iraq from 2017 to 19, Oman from 2014 to 17, and Yemen 2010 to 11. He was also the UK Syria envoy from 2012 to 14 and the regional Arabic spokesman from 2007 to 2009. Jon joined the FCDO in 1989 as an assistant desk officer, Iran in the Middle East Department. He was educated at Durham University, where he graduated with an MSc in Natural Sciences, and then later returned to the same university to study an MA in Middle East Politics, and follow this with an MPhil in International Relations from St Antony's College, Oxford. For the attendees today, we're on a Zoom webinar platform, so your videos and microphones cannot be displayed, and only panelists can be seen and heard. Please raise any questions by the Zoom Q&A function, either privately to me or publicly to the group if you wish. We'll try and get through as many of your questions once we've finished the discussions. I'll now pass over to Roddy. Thank you.
Thank you very much, Alex. And Jon, thank you so much for agreeing to join us today, fresh back from the UK, I know. We last spoke when we were hopefully in the cool of Malvern Woods, and now I know you've said it's well over 40 where you are in Doha. You're well known as an Arabist, a specialist in the part of the world where you're working now. You've got a number of challenges, of course, including the World Cup football coming up, which will be interesting. But I wonder if you could just start off by telling us and sharing with us, particularly as there are quite a lot of young people who will be thinking about their careers in the future, what led you to becoming a diplomat in the UK, now FCDO?
Thanks, Roddy. Thanks, Alex, and welcome everybody. It's a pleasure once again to be part of a session with Asia Scotland Institute. I didn't have any background in diplomacy or international relations, so in fact it was talking with a good friend of mine in my last year at university at Durham as an undergraduate when we were thinking about what we might do. And he suggested it, actually, so I didn't really know much about it, but I went down to the Career Centre, filled in the form, which was actually a civil service application form, but you ticked the diplomatic service box. Somewhat to my surprise, I got through the exams and decided to stay with being a diplomat. I thought for a few years before off to do something else, and here I am 33 years later. So it was purely by chance, and I hadn't got the chance to listen to many of the people who'd worked in the profession, but I'm very happy to share some thoughts on that today with our viewers and listeners.
That's wonderful, Jon. Thank you very much. And I would suggest and hazard a guess that between the time you joined and now, there have been huge changes within what was the Foreign Commonwealth Office, including, I think, the desiccation of your library and its dispersal at various times. But also, I suspect that the role has evolved and changed as someone who is a sort of manifestation of soft rather than hard power, with all the things going on in the world. So do chat with us a bit about the key things you think are important in being a good ambassador.
Well, I mean, I'll start off with the date. So I joined the Foreign and Commonwealth Office, as it then was, straight from university in 1989. And of course, that was the year when the international system, certainly in Europe or the Northern Hemisphere, appeared to change with the fall of the Berlin Wall and the transformation of relations with the then Soviet Union, which of course then dissolved a couple of years later. And it felt very much, and we were told by our seniors, you are joining at the start of a new era. That was in 1989. And now in 2022, I think one could argue the same thing, that we are now just over 30 years on, entering a new era. And it's not just because of Russia and what's happened with Ukraine, or the rise of China, or the threat of climate change. I think more than anything else, it is a swing of the pendulum, which, as we know through history, happens between an era when, in the 90s, we generally in the UK and across the world focused on building an international system, a set of rules and institutions that would enable us to preserve the peace and build trade, investment, and business relations. And that was very much a focus in those times. Didn't mean there weren't any conflicts, but I think it meant that people focused on diplomats as people who got things done. They weren't just upholding a system, they were building a system, and that system was supposed to deliver peace and prosperity. And here we are 30 years later, and it's not that globalization has ended or the international system has collapsed, but it's clearly looking rough around the edges. It's clearly a much more difficult, crisis-ridden time. And we're much more focused on things that seemed quite old-fashioned, like national interests, like war and peace, like the balance of power, like dealing with the consequences of conflict and its repercussions across the world. To give an example with Russia-Ukraine, of course, diplomats are trying to manage that conflict, but really the issue at the moment, because Russia is in no mood for diplomacy, and there are certain things where diplomacy is not relevant, and certainly the conquest and occupation of a neighbouring territory is not susceptible to diplomatic compromise or negotiation. But the issue we're dealing with, of course, is the food crisis and the energy crisis that is now spreading across the world. And while it's a big issue in domestic politics in the UK, quite rightly, it is much more of an issue across many developing countries, the global south. Many people will be aware that Sri Lanka is going through a huge crisis. Somalia, the threat of famine there. Conflict is being fueled in part by these crises. And that is an issue in which the whole of the world has an interest, because we still live in a world where something can happen in one country and it can impact on another across the world. So it does feel like there has been a swing of the pendulum back to what seemed like old-fashioned history. And a lot of people would say, you know, the holiday from history that we've had in the last 30 years is well and truly over.
That was what Fukuyama said, didn't he? That it was the end of history.
So the end of history he talked about, but I think, you know, his idea, I mean, he will defend himself and say that he certainly said that this needed managing to achieve, that it wasn't inevitable. But we can see now that we are back into something that feels, you know, quite old-fashioned. And I think one of the things about diplomacy is we need people who don't just develop through the experience of their careers a deeper understanding of how the international system works, but actually, you know, have a sense of history and the rhythms of history. And we have seen this before. The end of the 19th century was a great era of globalization. Diplomats were essentially managing an international system. And of course, you know, by the time we got to the First World War in the 30s, we were back into a crisis, and globalization had gone into reverse. So I'll maybe later talk a little bit about, you know, what I think is different about doing politics and diplomacy on the international level that is different from doing politics in a domestic setting.
Yeah, and what's also interesting, and you may deal with this later or now, is that in this runoff to choose the next head of the Conservative Party, and indeed the next Prime Minister, there's a lot of talk that suggests by both of the individuals concerned that development aid should be used in a way that can influence behavior. That is to say, if refugees are coming from a country which is receiving development aid from the UK, something should be done to stop them or to mitigate the situation that leads to their movement, because a lot of these people are economic migrants, aren't they?
So you're right. The movement of people is, if you like, the dimension of globalization that has been deliberately managed. So the movement of capital, the movement of goods and services, has vastly increased in recent decades. But the numbers of people on the move have been consistently increasing for positive and for crisis reasons. And of course, we know that's a big issue now across much of the world, and people want to use development budgets to make sure that economic opportunity is spread such that people don't feel they have to move from their home countries and home cultures. So that's an issue that won't go away, and I think it's an issue that's grown through the last 30 years. But of course, the other big issue, and again, this will drive, I think, the international system in the coming decades, is demographics as they are currently predicted. I mean, as many people will know, the UK, along with France, are predicted for the next decades through to the end of the century to more or less preserve or grow their populations. But that will largely be driven by citizens who have recently migrated. Many other countries in Europe, and indeed in Asia, China and Japan, and Russia, will see major population decreases, and that is going to be one of the dynamics that we will have to deal with.
Would it be true to say that because we know more about what's going on in the world since you became a diplomat, I mean, to the extent that you could be forgiven for having a nervous breakdown, all of the crises that you're aware of, that the social networks, the massive media information and feeds do affect the way in which people look at things? So
I think when I look at the big changes over the last 30 years, definitely the way people are networked has changed. We are all aware of this through social media, but I think it goes further than that. I think now data and the use of data in different ways is driving what some people have called a fourth industrial revolution. It's changing the way we earn our living. It's changing the way we achieve prosperity. And it's very often there is an international dimension. So I think, you know, if I look at the biggest change for diplomats, and let me just quickly define what I'm going to talk about. So of course, diplomacy is sometimes used to mean what heads of state or governments, rulers do. Sometimes that's called statesmanship or stateswomanship increasingly in the modern world, and that's another trend we've seen in the last 30 years, is a much greater gender balance at the top of the diplomatic tree, and the UK is no exception. In fact, I think we're a leader in that in many respects, not least through the number of senior female diplomats as well as women prime ministers. But it's also about the fact that, as I say, globalization is now going into one of its most challenging phases, and it's not yet reversed, but that is something for politicians and for their official advisors in international affairs to work on. And so diplomacy in some senses is about that profession of officials who represent states and governments and are given privileges and given trust and confidence to do that. And I'll come on later, maybe when talking about the choice of profession, to talk about diplomacy in that narrower professional sense. But of course, we are also talking about what goes on at the top level. And I think it's fair to say that politicians do value, in dealing with these crises, those who have a deep and long experience of some of the issues, not necessarily to accept their advice, but to avoid being caught in a constant reaction to the latest crisis of the day. And that's true for our politicians today more than it was maybe in the 90s. Not that there weren't any crises, but I remember one very distinguished statesman of the 90s, Douglas Hurd, said to me shortly after his retirement, it was amazing how many things went right in the 90s. And that certainly is not true today for our senior politicians. So I think the profession of diplomacy as advisors with deep experience of the issues, whether that advice is accepted or not, will still count, if not more so, in the modern world.
As we look, John, particularly at Pan-Asia, defined from Syria in the west to Japan in the east, I wonder how much time is spent on contingency planning, on thinking the unthinkable, on preparing for the unexpected. You mentioned quite rightly that a lot of diplomacy is reactive to situations. But how much have we been, during your time as a diplomat, on the front foot, ready to deal with issues. And the unexpected, like COVID, although we had SARS, of course, to warn us, the issues of Russian and Chinese territorialism, the pushing of the sovereign state concept. How much has forward-thinking and planning been adopted within the FCDO?
Well, I think this is a change which has grown in the last 10 years. So as we enter a more turbulent time, I think the skills around crisis planning and crisis management have counted for more of a premium. 20 or 30 years ago, as I was saying, when it looked like we were able to build and expand an international system, the focus was very much on the delivery of positive results as opposed to the management of crises, i.e. achieving good things rather than preventing bad things happening. Diplomats have to do both, but I think the balance has swung in recent years towards avoiding the bad things happening. The biggest, of course, is probably climate change and the future of the global environment. But it is also about making sure that whatever international institutions are doing at the moment, they are focused very much on resilience, which I think is a word that has come back into fashion, that we cannot assume that we can sail through difficult times without building resilience. So I think crisis management, resilience, these skills have come at a premium. That doesn't mean that diplomats aren't expected to achieve positive results, but everybody realizes that's a more difficult task in this day and age.
And not to lead the witness, sitting where you are in Doha, what is the view, if it can be described as such, as the Arab world of what is going on at the moment globally?
Well, I mean, we sit in West Asia, of course. Asia Scotland House very often focuses on the rise of Asia, of China, of the Far East, of India and the subcontinent and South Asia. Here, of course, we're sitting in an energy-rich area, although that is now contested as we try to move beyond hydrocarbons. But it is also an area, possibly more than any other within our horizons, that has been in crisis throughout the whole of this period. And the thing I would reflect on, and I think it is one of the major differences working in international affairs compared to domestic political affairs, certainly in Western countries, is the level of uncertainty and fragility with which one has to deal. The reality of my career over 30 years actually has been how it is dominated by what are called black swan moments. Now, people may have heard this term before, but it was has been theorized before many times, but most recently by Nicholas Nassim Taleb, about events that are basically unpredictable. They're outliers, but they have severe effects. And there's always an attempt to rationalize them and say they should have been predicted, they should have been dealt with. But actually, it's the nature of much of international affairs and global affairs. And I think being able to build resilience against these black swan moments, particularly in the Middle East, I think you could say that the history of this region and its effect on the rest of the world has been dominated by fundamentally unpredictable events, and going back to the Iranian Revolution, but of course 9/11 and the consequences that came from those. So I think the profession of diplomacy has to be one that uses deeper insights and understanding to manage what are inherently unpredictable situations. And for those who are contemplating or have already completed studies, I think it's worth remembering that successful theories in international relations as a discipline or as a subject area are really few and far between. Whereas if we look at something maybe more relevant to domestic politicians, economy or political economy, the number of theories that have been useful in making policy decisions has been much greater. So it is inherently a riskier, more fragile, more uncertain area to work in. But there are techniques for dealing with that, and crisis management techniques and focus on resilience are part of it.
At the Asia Scotland Institute, as you know, having been in Scotland and spoken to us before, we attach huge importance to spending time understanding the culture of the countries that we look at. The military expression, time spent in reconnaissance is seldom time wasted, has its impact or its relevance when people consider how best to deal with the situation in Sri Lanka, which you've mentioned, the situation in Ukraine, the situation in the part of the world where you are. And we believe that to educate and inspire tomorrow's leaders in Scotland is vitally important. And we're talking about a part of the world where, of course, Scotland, with its population slightly smaller than that of Singapore, has had historically an extraordinary impact over time, also in the part of the world where you are now. Do you feel that enough attention is paid to understanding the cultures of the different countries that play an important role in today's events?
Well, I think this was underplayed for a time, and it's now coming back as people see how difficult it is to manage uncertainty in a time of crisis. So I'm a pretty extreme example in that I learned Arabic early on, and I spent most of my career in the Middle East, and I'm now a fluent speaker of Arabic. Others, of course, will have done so for China and for Japan and other parts of Asia. This is one of the things that hasn't changed. It's sometimes forgotten, but one of the added uncertainties or risks in dealing in international affairs is communicating or doing business across cultural and linguistic boundaries. It's just more difficult. You have to be more careful about communication. And in part, that's around use of foreign languages. But let me go back 30 years when we seem to be in this world where English was the language of international business and science and technology, and a lot of people thought that the learning of foreign languages was a nice thing to have, but not necessarily essential. And I think that has been proven to be wrong. That building cultural and linguistic knowledge and using that to build agreements, common understandings, and ultimately deals is it's not old school, it is eternal school. And that's not just for diplomacy, that will be for business and indeed all interactions between people from different parts of the world.
For all its faults and the criticisms of it, I suppose, but with regards to learning languages, the Indian civil service was a prime example of people who had to speak a large number of languages and understand them before being posted to that part of the world, which included, of course, in terms of greater India, it included Afghanistan and then Pakistan and India and Bangladesh. You obviously think that understanding the languages of the people you deal with is very important.
I think it's important, and particularly for Asia, not just for Asia, but particularly for Asia. But there's another important point. To the extent it is true that English is a language so widely used in international affairs, it's important, I think, for native English speakers to use the language in a very clear way, because colleagues who speak good, fluent English but are not native speakers say that they always find native English speakers the most difficult to understand unless we keep it simple. So this point about communicating across linguistic and cultural boundaries is actually about the use of our own language as well as learning foreign languages.
Good, yeah. We've got, but before we take them, we've got a number of very interesting questions building up in the Q&A section here. But I wondered if you wanted to address any subjects that are more generally about life as a diplomat before we turn to the questions from the other.
Yeah, I might just use the case study of my life here in Qatar actually to show you a flavour of modern diplomacy. So as I was saying, we spent much of the last 30 years not dealing with crises, but actually building up the international system to deliver peace and prosperity. And for me here in Qatar, which is a very wealthy country on the basis of its gas reserves, business, trade and investment are a huge part of my time. So for instance, one of my biggest tasks in the next year is the Qataris have agreed to invest an extra £10 billion in the UK. And one of my jobs is to make sure that all the exciting things in the UK are known to the Qataris and to get that investment allocated, and that includes Scotland. So I made it my business to get around the country to find out what's going on. I did a virtual visit to Scotland actually during one of the COVID lockdowns. And I shall be doing a real visit in due course. But as many will be aware, we've got the World Cup, FIFA World Cup coming up in Qatar. That is an element of diplomacy that is probably the element that most people have come into contact with, and that will be consular support, making sure that British nationals, and particularly England and Wales fans, because we have 2 home teams who have qualified, but really any British nationals who are here participating or spectating, understand how to avoid trouble. And if they do get into trouble, know their rights, and where necessary, we can support them. And it could be anything from a lost passport to getting arrested and making sure that their trials pass due process. So we've got, the economic side and the prosperity side. We've also got the consular side, but also we want people to have a great time. And we want, as part of that, to project the UK. So we will be having all sorts of culture, entertainment, soft power promotions as well. We won't be the only country doing that, but we are unique in having 2 countries who are participating. So it's not all about, even in this difficult world of crises, it's not all about managing the downsides. This is a country which is a great friend of the UK, and where we have a great partnership to develop on the basis of success in recent years. So it's been a very positive experience. But that said, last summer, about a year ago, I was sitting here contemplating all the positive things I was going to do in the year ahead, and suddenly the Afghanistan file landed here in Qatar, where some people will be aware the US and the Taliban had talks going on for many years, brokered by the Qataris, where the US used Qatar as its main route out for the evacuation of its own and many other nationals. We were also part of that, and we were also setting up an embassy in exile here as we withdrew from Kabul, and then sending diplomats back into Kabul to continue dialogue with the Taliban. So, crises can occur at any time, even in what appears to be a cloudless sky. And that was a good reminder that diplomats, wherever they are, will always need to be ready to respond in a crisis.
Absolutely. How very interesting. Well, I wonder if we could now, because we can come back and talk again afterwards, if Alex, you could, I think there are 8 different questions in the Q&A, if you could select one and field that to Jon.
Sure. So we've got a previous speaker, Giles Chance, who is asking, does Britain see its diplomatic role inextricably tied up with the American diplomacy? Are there any thoughts of adopting more independent, neutral role between our American friends on one hand, and then Asian and possibly Chinese on the other, as well as the EU?
Interesting.
Thank you. That's a good way into one of the questions that was posed in the advert for the talk, which is what's particular about being a British diplomat. And I think, to put it at its simplest, the challenge for the UK, and it's not the only country because France has the same challenge, is to be about, on most major measures, economic and military and soft power and demographics, to be about 5th, 6th, 7th in most global rankings, and yet to have interests that are spread across the world. And so the challenge is building alliances, basically, because you can't, as a country that is in 5th, 6th or 7th place on many of these important measures, you can't manage the threats to your global interests or to promote all of those interests alone. So the issue then of your alliances, and for us, obviously, since the Second World War, the alliance with the US has been the most important, but also our alliances with European countries, with Japan, with Australia and Canada, and how we make the most of those to promote and defend our interests is always the question at the heart of British foreign policy. And as we know, for many, many decades, the choice of British foreign policy leaders, prime ministers and foreign secretaries has been to build our foreign policy around the alliance with the US. This is sometimes critiqued, and there are some people who said, we have to face the 21st century with a focus on Europe. That, of course, I think has been effectively decided by the vote in the Brexit referendum, that our relationships with Europe will be part of the wide spectrum of our relationships, but actually those with Asian powers, with Commonwealth countries, as well as the US, will be rebalanced. And that process, I think, is going to take quite a long time.
Thanks. Alex, another question?
Yes, it's from you and Grant. Obviously, we've spoken about the politics side and how business is also important, but on a sort of a global scale, are there any international organizations and sort of larger NGOs that you find yourself having to play sort of politics with, as well as, your counterparts in office?
Yeah. So I mean, let me just talk about my career as a whole, because that is one of the most important elements, I think, of being a diplomat at a time of globalization. So one of the effects of globalization, and it's been really apparent and growing for 50 years, is that while states and governments and diplomats in official positions have continued to play an important role in international relations, actually the overlap between domestic politics and international politics, and the role of actors outside of governments, whether it's NGOs, whether it's businesses, has grown. And so I think one of the skills that a modern diplomat really needs is to be able to network and build alliances, not just with other states and other governments, but with allies and experts well outside of government. I don't think we've done that as well as we might, but I think the UK is one of the countries that is committed to doing that more and more. And we're very lucky in the UK to have real strength in NGOs, real strength in business, real strength in think tanks and academics that give us a really good chance, not just to project soft power in that way and to attract people from all over the world to come and live and study and work here in the UK, but also to really make sure that we are a world leader in what has been called smart power, which is the way you combine all your military and economic assets with your soft power assets to give you the maximum chance of promoting and defending your interests.
Thank you. A couple more. So from Naomi, she was asking your view on why the British government's shutting down of the Britain-Russian Centre almost 2 decades ago might have been a wiser decision to keep it in light of what's happening in Ukraine. She was loving to get your thoughts on sort of their sort of maybe thought process within that.
Yeah, I mean, that's a good example of one of the great choices that politicians have to make and diplomats have to advise on, is do you engage in certain situations or do you sanction or boycott in certain situations? Those decisions have to be taken in full view of all the facts, at the time. I'm facing it here in Qatar, where a lot of people are saying, should Qatar host the World Cup? Should the issue of labour rights mean that we should boycott? In this particular case, we are choosing to engage and achieve progress. But the questioner is quite right to point out that, and this is particularly germane to the debate on China right now, if you cut all engagements, your chance to influence is less. But there are some times when diplomacy and engagement clearly offer no positive benefits and probably actually a negative. And under those circumstances, the decision can be different. But they are very often difficult decisions, and that's what the politicians get paid for.
Thank you. And we got a question from John here. And he was asking, to what extent do you think that Her Majesty's government has appropriate mechanisms for providing warning of such crises like the Afghan crisis, and to what extent is government adequately receptive of those said warnings?
Well, as I said, we're dealing with a fundamentally, black swans are a key characteristic of international affairs. So we need to be a little bit careful about setting our sights too high in terms of predictions and theories. And so what we need to do is the sort of contingency planning for different scenarios, including worst case scenarios that we have to remind ourselves that they can and do happen, even if they are unpredictable. So I think that issue has been prioritized. I think it's moved up the agenda. I think resilience, as I said, as a concept, crisis contingency planning, bringing in expertise, devoting more resource to it. It costs to do this. I think we've moved away from the idea of just-in-time responses, whether that's in diplomacy or in business, and we're focusing much more on resilience. But it costs. It puts prices up. It's an added burden on the taxpayer, and so a balance always has to be achieved.
Thank you. From Robert Hogarth, how can diplomatic service go about trying to improve human rights in countries where it is fairly diabolical?
Yeah. So the international system, as it has developed since the Second World War, has had human rights at its heart. I think most people are aware of the UN Declaration on Human Rights. We've got international courts, international human rights institutions, a very strong range of international NGOs who work on human rights. So I think we've developed something in the last 70 years, and the UK has been at the heart of that development, which is incredibly valuable. But it works largely through naming and shaming, as opposed to through international law with sanctions. Now, there are some exceptions to that, and there is a debate about whether we can strengthen those mechanisms. It is really unfortunate, not the UK is going to give up on this, that the way the international system is going at the moment, where we have revisionist powers who are very central to the workings of the UN, I'm thinking of Russia and China, who have a very different view on human rights within the international system, and believe that national sovereignty should always be asserted, and international criticism should always be deprioritized. And that debate is coming through in relation to Hong Kong and Tibet and to Xinjiang and to what's going on inside Russia and also in Ukraine and neighboring countries. But I think you can see that there's bipartisan Labour Conservative really across the political spectrum, that the UK will remain a leading advocate and player in human rights, and we would advocate strengthening the system and giving it more teeth. But we have to work through the international system as it is, and that is getting more and more difficult.
Would you say, John, that some of the organisations that we know, UN, IMF, and others, have outlived their useful life and should be reformed?
So the UK's always been in favour of the reform of the UN, the adaptation of the UN. It was actually really difficult back in the 90s when everything was going so well to put reform high up the agenda, and reform of the Security Council, which of course is very necessary, which reflects the conditions of 1945, not 2022, is made more difficult by any country that you could logically propose to put on will have a nearby neighbouring or a country of equal rank who will insist on either stopping it or having themselves also put on. So, Argentina, Brazil, Italy, Germany, this sort of thing. So reform, yes. The UN is in a critical state. We have to admit that, but we would have to invent it if it wasn't there. It has probably been the institution that has most created an international system that helps the whole world manage crises and to promote peace. It is an imperfect institution, but we shouldn't let the good be the enemy of the perfect. But it's not working right now. And one of the things I think when we've got through this period, particularly with Russia, Ukraine, and China, Taiwan, is look again at how we can make the UN function and reform it in a way that makes it more adapted to the world of today. But if we look at the world before the UN, obviously the League of Nations in the period between the First and Second World Wars, and then in the 19th century when international institutions were very few and far between, we clearly have benefited, the whole world has benefited hugely through having this very, very central institution, however imperfect and however sclerotic it is right now.
Yeah. Alex, do you want to just mention Graham Lean's question, which involves Turkey?
Yes, sir. Where does the UK stand in the ongoing tussle between Iran, the US, Arab countries, Turkey and Russia?
So the UK's got diplomatic relations with all of the above named. So that gives us an insight and an ability to influence. But I think it's fair to say that the prospects for normalizing relations with Iran in particular look extremely slim right now, and that will have an impact on the Middle East. I mean, the deal on the table to renew what's called the Iran nuclear deal, or the JCPOA, has been really one of the most important achievements of diplomacy in the last decade. But the chances of getting that agreement renewed, and even the agreement as it stands is weaker than it was, are really in the balance at the moment, and diplomats continue to work on that behind the scenes. It's not always in the news. But if you wanted to ask me for a good example of how diplomacy has helped prevent a crisis or to manage a difficult situation, then I think the Iran nuclear deal, the JCPOA, is one of the best examples. And although it hangs in the balance, I wish all the colleagues the best of luck. And of course, the UK has full diplomatic relationships with Iran, and indeed England and Wales have been drawn with Iran in the same group in the World Cup. So we will be part of the ongoing international diplomacy to prevent the Middle East turning into an arena for a nuclear arms race.
Thank you. And sort of based off that, we've seen the UN be sort of successful and functional in a more Western world, and as we've seen that slowly sort of disintegrate in the coming years and recent years, do you think that, well, as John put it, do you think you would see the UN completely reformed, and do you think that would be the role of the US, or do you think as China becomes more vocal, it'll be more of a sort of bipartisan agreement between them?
Well, I mean, the UN is not a power in its own right, although it is very influential within the international system. And the US and China, I think, really now in the next couple of decades will stand alone at a group of two, if you like, at the top of the international system. So the future of US-China relations will have a big impact on whether the UN, certainly at the level of the Security Council, if you like, the power politics of the UN can operate. And as many people will be aware, the UN, while it is also a forum for power politics and international diplomacy, it is also a forum for development and humanitarian work. And the great work that the UN does in those areas is continuing, not wholly hamstrung by political differences at the Security Council and among the great powers. And the UK continues to be a major donor and supporter of that. And that will make a huge difference to the way, particularly the Global South and the world can manage the food and energy crises in the next couple of years. So I don't want to detract from the importance of the great work the UN continues to do, even while recognizing that it needs reform, and it is currently hamstrung by the differences between the US, Russia and China.
It seems to have quite a strong Secretary General, though, who is admired for what he's attempting to do.
Yes, and the Secretary General, has a powerful voice, but it's a sort of secular version of the Pope in the Vatican. He doesn't have the tanks. That's the difference.
The expression that Thucydides' trap has been much used. As you know, the idea of the rising power overtaking I suppose the top power as it diminishes in some ways. China being shown as the rising power, India not far behind it, I guess. What's your view of that? Is that just a theory that has little meaning now?
Yeah, so of course that is one of the most famous theories of international relations, going all the way back to Thucydides. So the idea that there will always be inevitable competition between established powers and rising powers. And while that is true, I don't think it's, like most theories in international relations, it's not 100% true. I mean, if you think about the situation 130 years ago, 140 years ago, with the US rising to the #1 position and the UK descending from the #1 position. In fact, the US and UK managed it, despite a lot of frictions, rather well. And the First World War was a black swan moment. It wasn't the prediction of the theory that a conflict would arise between the UK and the US. It was a black swan moment by the assassination of the Archduke Franz Ferdinand that caused the First World War. So I think we must never get into a trap that any theory is 100% valid. So I think the attitude of modern diplomats should be a sort of humble confidence that we can do a lot of good through the international system, managing downsides as well as achieving positive goals. But we have to recognize that bad stuff, unpredictable bad stuff, will always happen.
This is when we set up this event with you, Jon. We talked about 3 questions that we might look at particularly, and I think we've dealt with them pretty well. What is the role of diplomats in the modern world? What are the particulars of being a UK diplomat? And is this a career worth recommending? Let's just focus on the third one. As the wise professional diplomat, is this a career worth recommending to one's son or daughter?
Yeah,
something really worthwhile. And if
well,
so, why?
As I said, when I started, I thought I'd do it for a few years. It would be a great experience, and I'd move on to other things. And here I am, 33 years later. So, what's kept me here in this career? And I think it is the people you deal with, whether it's your foreign hosts or whether it's the other players and actors in business, the NGOs, the international system. And it's the issues, big issues from climate change, economic transformation, war and peace, negotiations on new treaties and agreements to regulate different sectors of the economy. It's a really, really absorbing career, and the experience you build up in it is valuable. As I said earlier on, I think politicians today, in a obviously unpredictable world full of crises, where they're dealing with black swan moment after black swan moment, I think they do value. Sometimes they will question whether diplomats are risk avoiders or always wanting to negotiate a compromise. And it is true that living as we do in a very risky and fragile space, we do tend to be more careful. It is sometimes a politician's jobs to take a more decisive or dramatic position. But the advice that we give does add value. And I think it means the profession continues, even though for decades people have said diplomacy as a profession, the institutions of foreign ministries and ambassadors, we wouldn't invent them today if they didn't already exist. I think it is true to say that there's a skill set which goes from political judgment, the ability to communicate carefully and clearly, deep understanding of different countries and cultures and the international system, and an ability to deliver positive results from networks, from influence, is a rare and valuable skill set. It doesn't only belong to those who spent a lifetime in the career, but it is not easy to gather all those skills through doing a patchwork career in other areas. So I think diplomacy as a profession will continue, but it should be open because there are plenty of skills that people can bring into it. And in the UK, we are open to recruiting people into the diplomatic service who come from business, who come from defence, who come from development agencies, who come from the third sector, as well as the private sector. So I think diplomacy continues, but it will have to continue with, as I said, a humble confidence and be judged not just by its positive results, but on the prevention of bad things happening, which is sometimes difficult to prove, counterfactuals.
John, and contrast that, and this isn't meaning to be critical, with the American approach to diplomatic appointments. The key ambassadorships going to people who have been major donors to and supporters of the administration, and not people who have come up as diplomats through the professional route you've referred to. I find it quite surprising, and so have others, that the United States doesn't have a system more similar to what we do, since their diplomatic corps presumably grew out of the old UK model.
So, as you know, Roddy, and some others may know online, my wife is a US diplomat, retired ambassador. He's actually just sitting across the room from me at the moment. So in some ways I should let her answer this question. But what I would say, we have discussed this ourselves, what you find is that if you put in a political appointee, and we do it occasionally, but we've largely kept a professional ambassadorial card, as has France and most other European countries. You do rely on the professional skills of the deputy to support the political appointee, who may or may be a donor or in some way a political figure themselves. And so what you do is you put into that relationship the relationship that exists, you know, in every country between the politicians who are taking the decisions and then the advice they receive from their diplomats and foreign ministries. So, you know, that relationship, whether it resides between ambassadors and foreign ministers, or whether it resides between the ambassador and the deputy, is the key relationship that is valued. And I think that will sustain the profession of diplomacy in the decades to come.
Thank you. Thanks very much. Alex, do you have any other questions you want to draw out? One more?
Sure. Yeah. So one from Nick. So we've discussed at great lengths the sort of the growing complexity of diplomacy, and Nick strongly agrees with the idea of smart power. But he sort of questions how our government works all these levers, and how can it in the future if it isn't doing it quite right now.
Yeah. So, I mean, you said earlier on that my first degree was natural sciences. And so one of the things that I enjoy most about the job I'm doing now, with the way diplomacy is going, is that we are involved in the regulation, promotion, and the negotiation of new agreements around a lot of new technologies that some people would say are tantamount to a new industrial revolution. And so this is bringing together, you know, amazing, exciting developments in cyberspace, with new ways of working with materials, but also bio and life sciences, and bringing them all together. So I think, you know, one of the things that's happening with diplomacy is that we are, you know, increasingly recruiting and needing to recruit people who are confident and knowledgeable about science and technology, about the science of climate change, about what this fourth industrial revolution is really all about. And so I think the issue of who should be a diplomat, you know, which changes generation on generation, will go through a period now with people far more expert than me in some of these areas, where we will have people who bring together both, you know, immense technological and scientific expertise with that broad range of political and communications skills, personal impact that I mentioned. And I think that's the way we will see a lot of diplomacy, certainly representing Western countries. That's the way we will see it go. And I think people may have seen it in Glasgow for COP26 as well, where we had a lot of people doing that diplomacy who were experts in their field, as well as people working in embassies across the world to build consensus around as ambitious a set of agreements as we could get. So I think that's the direction of travel. I don't think there's any complacency that we've got there yet. I mean, when I joined Foreign Commonwealth Office 30 years ago, any degree was accepted. I think now we will give some preference to people who don't just have economics or law degrees, but those who've got expertise in areas of science, technology, and the world that we are going to live in through the fourth industrial revolution in the 21st century.
John, thank you very much. I think we're drawing out to the hour because we're almost there. So I'd like, on behalf of the Age of Scotland Institute, all the people who have, and there are many, been listening to this talk, to thank you for, how can I put it, good for an Oxford man, a Durham man, a very perceptive tour d'horizon, which, if I were much younger, I would find a very attractive proposition of going out and not, what was that, you can remember it, the quote of going out and lying for your country. Who said that?
A diplomat is an honest man who goes abroad to lie for his country.
I'm sure that that's not true in your case. So we're really grateful to you, and what you have said, based where you are, has huge implications, of course, for how we view and deal with crises, interlocking crises around the world, whether it be in Ukraine or in Southeast Asia or elsewhere. There's so many problems to solve, and it seems to me that one of the key skills that an ambassador has to have is to be not only a realist, but also probably a bit of an optimist, to keep going in the face of all sorts of adversities. So, as you have done. So, on behalf of us all, thank you so much for your time. I know today was the day I think you got back home to where you are now. And so, as your cases are almost only just unpacked, thanks again so much, and really, really interesting talk.
Thank you, Roddy. Thanks, Alex. Thanks, everybody. It's been a pleasure, and look forward possibly to doing one of these live in Scotland when I'm up there for my next visit.
Absolutely. And when the universities are back too, that would be great. Good.
Very good.
So thank you very much.
Thank you. Thanks, everybody.